Buenos días a todas y a todos. Muchísimas gracias por venir hoy aquí, por compartir este tiempo con nosotras y nosotros. Me gustaría, en primer lugar, empezar presentando a las dos personas que nos van a acompañar. Tenemos a nuestro lado a Michael Sandel, profesor de Derecho de la Universidad de Harvard, miembro de la Academia Estadounidense de las Artes y las Ciencias, Premio Princesa de Asturias de Ciencias Sociales, autor de obras como Justicia, Hacemos lo que debemos y La tiranía del mérito, entre otros. Por otro lado, estamos con Adam Adatto Sandel, también profesor de Derecho en la Universidad de Harvard, Premio Leo Strauss, autor de varios libros, entre los que se encuentra Felicidad en acción, que acaba de ser traducido al castellano. Fuera de la academia también se ha distinguido por haber logrado un récord Guinness por mayor número de nominadas en un minuto, y creo que no tenemos la oportunidad de conocer todos los días a alguien con un récord Guinness, así que de verdad estamos muy contentos de teneros a los dos aquí. Michael y Adam son padre e hijo, y en esta charla vamos a hablar de algunas cuestiones centrales en su pensamiento en torno a la justicia, la vida buena y el bien común. Antes de comenzar la conversación, me gustaría pediros un fuerte aplauso para nuestros invitados, Michael y Adam. Okay. Here we go. Para empezar, me gustaría tirar del hilo que da nombre a este encuentro, Culturas del bienestar. Ambos habéis reflexionado en vuestras respectivas obras sobre el bien común, la vida buena y otras nociones que forman parte de ese léxico de la filosofía política que quiere pensar en última instancia cómo podemos vivir en comunidad y hacerlo en la medida de lo posible bien, para nosotros y para los otros. ¿Cuáles os parecen que son algunos de los principales motivos por los que hablamos, negando el título, de culturas del malestar? ¿Por dónde deberíamos empezar para transformar la desazón, la ira, la rabia, la tristeza que forman parte de ese malestar cultural para hablar ahora sí de culturas del bienestar?
Well, first, thank you, Irene, for moderating this conversation. And if I could just begin by identifying two sources of discontent, one at the level of society, the other at the level of our everyday lives, our personal lives. At the level of society, in countries around the world, there is deep polarization and frustration with public life, with politics, and with the political alternatives that politicians put before us. And at the level of our personal lives, there is a deep unhappiness. Happiness is difficult to achieve. In fact, the harder we try, the more we fall short, it seems, which now it's on the level of individual life, the individual pursuit of happiness. I think that may be connected to our frustrations with politics, with democracy. But here is where Adam's book, Happiness in Action, offers what he calls a philosopher's guide to the good life. So I wonder if Adam could begin in responding to this question by describing why it is that the harder we try to achieve happiness, the more unhappy, it seems, we become.
Well, I think the pursuit of happiness as a goal, which is very prominent these days, and you see it proposed actually in a lot of self-help literature, may actually lead us astray, this expectation to be happy all of the time, to aspire for happiness understood as a state of mind, contentment, pleasure. And what that misses, I think, is the connection between happiness in the genuine and fullest sense and meaningful activity. And my goal in the book is to try to connect happiness to activity, to action, and to identify ways of acting that are intrinsically fulfilling and that don't require the completion of some goal to bring a kind of genuine satisfaction. But the satisfaction isn't simply a mental state, it's a kind of joy or exuberance in the activity itself.
So, could I follow
Of course.
up with that? In the spirit of Irene's question about the relation between seeking the good life in our individual lives and seeking the common good in our collective lives, one common thread in the way we fall short these days seems to be, well, beginning with Adam's account of striving for happiness, seeking after goals, a goal-driven life. What seems, well, what I've learned from Adam's book about the inadequacy of that way of seeking the good life is that we make ourselves into instruments or objects of the goals we seek, and that leaves us with lives that are ultimately unsatisfying and maybe even empty of meaning. Do I have that right?
Yes, I think part of it is the fear of failure, that if you stake your identity on the completion of a goal, there's a lot of anxiety associated with attempting to achieve the goal as efficiently as you can. That's one part of it, but then the other part of it is a kind of aimlessness that one experiences even when one succeeds. So the achievement of a goal that you've set for yourself may lead to momentary satisfaction. You celebrate for an evening, but gradually the feeling of happiness slips away, and you're asking yourself, well, what do I do now? And so there's a kind of vicious cycle between the completion of goals, setting new ones, completing them, and being stuck all over again. So I think what's really necessary for happiness is achieving a way of being throughout the whole of one's life, throughout every moment that one lives, that is constant, that is stable, but at the same time opens up opportunities for boundless adventure and self-discovery.
So here then I think, Irene, is the common thread between seeking the good life in our personal lives and seeking the common good in public life. The way Adam's critique of a goal-driven, instrumental approach to happiness, in a way, provides the foundation for the kind of critique I've made of the notions of the common good that we lack, is when our public life is conceived in market terms or as a technocratic project. That too introduces an instrumental, objectifying stance toward the common life we share. If what it means to be a democratic citizen is simply to be a consumer seeking to satisfy our consumer desires in a market economy, and deciding what's valuable based on how the market prices our labor, our contributions, then we too become instruments of this way, of this impoverished way of thinking about the common good, is simply aggregating the satisfaction of individual consumer desires. And when we use technology as a tool to make it even more efficient to seek after our desires, that further instrumentalizes us. So do you think that makes out for a common thread between the two?
Sí, a mí Me parece que una de las cosas que está presente en vuestras obras y que creo que engarza bien con lo que habéis estado comentando ahora es un término que utiliza Adam y es ese estar unido a las cosas, ¿no? Me voy a permitir, perdóname Adam, que sé que a veces da un poco de pudor citar y leer las palabras que uno mismo ha escrito, me voy a permitir citar algo que creo que pueda ayudar para el público, para entender de qué estamos hablando. Escribe Adam en su libro: la propia distinción entre libre albedrío y determinismo solo tiene sentido cuando se ha asumido desde el principio que el yo es, en su esencia, un sujeto investido de su propia capacidad independiente de elección que se enfrenta a un mundo externo de objetos o a una sociedad que ejerce la presión de una conformidad opresiva. Esto no niega, desde luego, la posibilidad de incidir en el mundo, ni el hecho de que nosotros, como sujetos, seamos de la forma que somos porque habitamos un determinado lugar y un momento. Sin embargo, si se mira desde la perspectiva de sistemas de interdependencia, que es el término que utiliza Adam, parece que esa frontera infranqueable entre lo que es el mundo, donde tendríamos que buscar todas esas cosas que estabais hablando para satisfacer nuestro propio ego y conseguir esa felicidad, ¿no?, entre el mundo y nosotros, esa frontera desaparece en los términos en los que plantea Adam. Entonces, quisiera saber cómo creéis que podemos pensar las relaciones de dependencia con los otros, pero no solo con los otros sujetos humanos, sino con los otros animales, con la naturaleza, con los ecosistemas, es decir, cómo podemos pensar eso que se llama interdependencia o ecodependencia, que en el caso de la obra de Adam creo que es central.
Yeah.
Well, this notion of interdependence is very fundamental to the book. What I tried to express is a conception of human agency and freedom that has to do not with imposing one's will on the world, but of understanding, responding, and cultivating the world in which one finds oneself. I could give an example of this, if I may. Well, I'm a big sports fan, and tennis is one of the sports that I've followed for a very long time. And Federer and Nadal, of course, you know, I know Nadal here is, well, worldwide he's a great figure, but we're in Spain, so we can celebrate Nadal. and when he would play Federer, there was a kind of mutual dependence. Each of them had his distinctive style of play. Federer with his artistry, the way he would almost dance around the court, the angles he would find. Nadal with his intensity and his ability to hit with such vicious topspin. So we had two opponents, each trying to defeat the other. So in one sense, you could say, well, each is trying to impose his will on the other. But I think that's a very incomplete and superficial understanding of the play, because at the same time, each needs the other. And both of them need the sport of tennis, that the way the court is arranged, the way that the rules are designed, are to elicit certain virtues, certain skills that go beyond winning and losing. So I would be willing to bet that if you asked Federer and Nadal, would you rather win the match to achieve your goal, finals of, I don't know, Wimbledon, finals of Wimbledon, would you rather win, but the way you win is by forfeit? The other player, is unable to complete the match. Or would you rather have a really epic competition that displayed tennis in new ways that nobody had ever seen before and brought out the excellence of the game? I'm sure that each of them would say the second, even if it meant that they lost. And Federer once said after a match with Nadal, Federer had won, and he said, well, it was a pity actually that somebody had to win this match, because I would have preferred that we would just play on and on and on, because it was such a great game. So this is what I mean by interdependence, that we're connected to others, to our opponents even, who if all goes well, can make us stronger, better, and also to nature, to the surrounding world.
And just to ask a follow-up, so you've given this account of interdependence that Irene was asking about, and is that connected to the other theme you mentioned earlier, activity for its own sake, not for the sake of some external goal?
Yes, because the goal, of course, is to play on, and to play on in a way that displays the game at its best. And there's something intrinsic to the game that's bigger than either of the competitors, even though each is necessary for it.
Okay, gracias. Me gustaría preguntaros, aunque Michael ya ha comentado algo, adelantaba un poco la pregunta o anticipaba la pregunta que quería hacer, me gustaría preguntaros si podéis profundizar por esos dos conceptos que a mí me parece que son muy centrales en vuestros trabajos, y es la noción de vida buena, que en el caso de Adam está en el título del libro, para pensar cómo vivir nuestro presente, y una reactualización de la propuesta aristotélica, que creo que es muy clara en su trabajo. Pero por otro lado, Michael, también en un título de tu trabajo aparece esa noción del bien común. Y lo llenas de sentido y señalas precisamente que el bien común no puede ser solo términos económicos y el mérito tecnocrático. Y quisiera que pensáramos quizá cuál puede ser esa unión más allá de una perspectiva individualista y una perspectiva comunitaria, ¿no? ¿Cuál podría ser el punto de engarce donde deberían coincidir mi proyecto individual de vida, mi proyecto de vida buena, con el bien común que comparto con los otros en comunidad?
Yes, well, I think there is a close connection between these themes at the level of individual happiness and at the level of society. And if we look now at the deep polarization that our societies confront, the anger even that we see in politics, in political debate, the suspicion that citizens have for one another. Nobody is happy about this, and yet we don't seem capable of breaking out of it. So what's the source of this deep polarization? I think part of it, and this is what you were suggesting, Irene, about my critique of meritocracy, a market-driven meritocratic idea of success and of achievement. Mm-hmm. In recent decades, the divide between winners and losers has been deepening, poisoning our politics, setting us apart. This has partly to do with widening inequalities of income and wealth, but it's not only that. It has also to do, I think, with the changing attitudes towards success that have accompanied the widening inequalities. Those who've landed on top have come to believe that their success is their own doing, the measure of their merit, and that they therefore deserve the bounty the market bestows upon them, and by implication, that those who struggle, those left behind, must deserve their fate too. Now, this way of thinking about success, this individualistic way of thinking about success, reflects a seemingly attractive ideal, the ideal of meritocracy, the idea that if everyone starts the race at the same starting point, the winners deserve their winnings. But what this forgets, well, it leads the successful to forget the role of luck and good fortune that helped them on their way. It leads the successful to forget their indebtedness to those who make our achievements possible. Family, teachers, community, country, the times in which we live. So I do think there is a connection between Adam's critique of a purely goal-driven, instrumental seeking of happiness, which is ultimately individualistic and misses the interdependence, the mutual dependence of Federer and Nadal, competing but also developing a certain kind of mutual recognition and friendship. I think there is a close connection between Adam's critique of this mistaken way of seeking happiness in a purely individualistic, goal-driven way, and the discontent of democracy that arises from the polarized condition where the winners look down on the losers and say it's your fault, and forget the obligation, the mutual obligations we have as citizens for one another. What do you think?
No, simplemente estaba pensando, no sé si Adam quiere añadir algo, pero me preguntaba cómo reconciliamos esa propuesta, que yo creo que es muy claro lo que pasa en esa dicotomía entre ganadores y perdedores, con un término que es central también en Adam, ¿no? Y que da nombre a 2 capítulos, esa autodeterminación, ¿no? Tú dices self-possession del individuo para también determinarse y entender cuáles son sus objetivos que puede inscribir o que puede realizar en una comunidad. Tú normalmente dices, y a mí me hace bastante ilusión, como no, siempre hablas de una red comunitaria trazada por familia, amigos, vecinos, pero dices profesores, ¿no? Entonces también el rol de la educación creo que es algo que podríamos discutir o que me gustaría conversar con vosotros, puesto que los dos sois profesores, en esas deudas de las que estábamos hablando, que tenemos con los otros, incluso los que somos menos ganadores, pero ¿no? que tampoco estamos quizá en ese grupo, que no nos sentimos del grupo de los perdedores, que debemos a esa figura del profesor que tú mencionas en tu libro, y que, puesto que los dos ejercéis ese trabajo, quizá...
Do you want to start with that?
Connecting the idea of self-possession to the difficulties facing our society. Well, one way of describing what I mean by the virtue of self-possession is taking joy and pride in one's work or activity for its own sake. So in the workplace, that would mean not simply for the sake of a paycheck, whether the paycheck is simply to put food on the table, necessity, or whether the paycheck is to buy luxury items. Both perspectives in their own way are goal-oriented perspectives, and I think one of the difficulties, and you can comment on this, is that in our economies today, people have lost a sense of place and belonging tied to their work, so they don't understand their work as intrinsically fulfilling, precisely because the society in which they live doesn't respect or recognize the work that they do as in some way contributing to a common good. So, for example, if I work in manufacturing, bringing manufacturing jobs back to the United States is a very big political issue. But it isn't simply about bringing them back, because even if we have them, the question remains, well, are these jobs going to be respected and honored in our society? Yeah. And that's really an open question. And I think it's necessary that politics addresses work, the dignity of work, which you've written a lot about, as a way of, realizing a sense of self-possession, but also coming to understand oneself as connected to the common good.
Yeah. Yeah, I agree. And when we have debates about justice, we often think and talk mainly about distributive justice. What is a fair way of distributing income and wealth, for example? And that's important. But what we sometimes overlook is another aspect of justice, which is contributive justice, giving everyone the opportunity, and here's where the dignity of work comes in, giving everyone the opportunity to contribute to the economy and to the common good, and to win honor and recognition and social esteem for the contributions they make. I think, to go back to the discontent facing democracy, a lot of it has to do, and a lot of the anger people who are left behind, is not only about material deprivation, about some getting rich while wages have been stagnating for working people. Beyond that, it's that many working people feel that the contributions they make aren't honored and recognized, as Adam was saying. And I think our deepest human need and civic need is the need to be needed by our fellow citizens, or family members, or community. And this is why the dignity of work is so necessary a response to the anger and polarization that threatens democracy today, to find a way to honor the dignity of work. Now, you mentioned, I don't want to ignore your question, Irene, about teachers. In a way, it's too easy a question. The three of us are teachers.
We're biased.
Yes.
Claro.
So, of course, we think that education is an enormously important contribution to the common good. But to show that it's not merely the three of us who think so, here's a thought experiment. Think of the most inspiring teacher you had in school. Mm-hmm. And I suspect that most people here can probably even remember the name of that teacher. Am I right about that?
Sí.
Yes? Now think about that. And for some of us, that's been quite a long time, and still we remember. Do you remember the name of your...
Absolutamente
okay.
sí.
Okay. Now, that suggests that teachers make enormously important contributions to individual lives and also to society. What was the pay that teacher of yours, the best teacher, received? How much did he or she make? What would it be in Spain? What did yours?
1800.
Yeah.
Sí, poco.
Yeah.
Poco, en cualquier caso, poco.
Well, I was going to compare that pay. How much does Elon Musk make? By comparison, how much, maybe this is a better comparison, did Taylor Swift make last year? Now, so we and from that, would we conclude that what Taylor Swift contributes to the common good is 5,000, 10,000 times more valuable than what your best teacher contributes to the common good? When we think about it that way, most people would say, well, no, that's not a good measure of what's a truly valuable contribution. But when we leave it to markets to define what's valuable, what we do is we outsource our moral judgment about value to markets. And they get it wrong. And what that suggests is that we need to reclaim, as democratic citizens, fundamental questions about value. What's valuable? What's a valuable contribution to the common good? Which suggests a morally more robust kind of public discourse than the kind to which we're accustomed.
Sí, de hecho, yo lo que me estaba surgiendo mientras te escuchaba era precisamente eso, ¿no? Que el reconocimiento que pedimos los profesores, pues porque somos los que estamos aquí, ¿no? Pero muchos otros profesionales, no es solo un reconocimiento social y público de cariño y de afecto, que también es necesario y que está bien, sino también de las condiciones materiales. Y entonces ahí es donde tenemos que hablar efectivamente de justicia redistributiva y de salarios más parecidos, quizá, ¿no? Y seguramente así esa brecha de la que tú hablas y a la que dedicas un capítulo en La tiranía del mérito, ganadores y perdedores, comienza a desaparecer.
Right. Yeah.
Sí, no sé.
Well, doesn't it depend partly on how you characterize the meaning of a wage? Because if you think of the wage simply in terms of purchasing power,
Right.
That isn't enough, because the wage really represents more. It's how society is honoring the contribution that you make.
Yeah.
So the two seem quite
They're
closely connected. And you see this with contract negotiations all the time. In sports, someone rejects $20 million because they think they deserve 30, and it wouldn't really materially affect their way of life, but they find it a dishonor to be offered less when other players are being offered more. And I think that can be extended broadly to the economy at a much more mundane level.
And we saw this during the pandemic, when those of us with the luxury of working or teaching from home couldn't help but recognize how deeply we depend on workers we often overlook. Mm-hmm. Delivery workers, warehouse workers, grocery store clerks, nurse assistants, childcare workers. Now, these are not the best paid or most honored members of our society, but for a moment during the pandemic, we called them essential workers, key workers. You remember we applauded them at the end of the day. We put up signs thanking them. It could have been a moment, this goes to your point about pay and recognition. It could have been a moment for a broader public debate about how to bring their pay and recognition both into better alignment with the importance of the work they do. But it didn't happen. The pandemic receded and we went back to business as usual.
No rescatamos, no salvamos nada, no conseguimos aprender nada de eso. En tu opinión, Michael, estabas diciendo ahora, podía haber sido un momento, pero no lo fue. ¿Hay algo que te parezca que sí que rescatamos, que sí que aprendimos y que quizá nos ha ayudado a contribuir a ese bien común? ¿Hemos conseguido mejorar algo? ¿Hemos aprendido algo como sociedad en estos 4 años que nos separan de 2020?
I don't think we learned very much. Because at the beginning of the pandemic, it seemed as though we might. Because you remember at the beginning, we were saying, and commentators were telling us, this shows that despite our inequalities, we are all vulnerable as human beings to the same virus. And therefore, we are all in this together. You remember that phrase, we are all in this together. That was in the early days of the pandemic. But what we found, unfortunately, as the pandemic continued, is that it highlighted inequalities that existed before the pandemic. And so there was the potential to learn a lesson about our common fate, our mutual dependence. But that lesson faded. It didn't last, I'm afraid. And so now we're deeply polarized, all the more so.
And that way of thinking, that logic, has very deep roots in the modern philosophical tradition. Thomas Hobbes argued that the fear of violent death is sufficient to unite society, that whatever our disagreements are, we can at least agree on the conditions for any pursuit whatsoever, and that's being alive. Okay. There's an analogy there, a very close analogy to the pandemic. Here, the death wasn't violent, as Hobbes was imagining wars of religion, but the idea that certain basic conditions of mere survival are sufficient to unite human society, and that was proven wrong.
So fear, I love that point.
Wow.
So that's an amazing point. So you're saying that I hadn't thought of the connection between the moral significance of the pandemic and Thomas Hobbes's philosophy. But Thomas Hobbes matters especially because in a way he was the founder of modern political thinking. So you're saying that the fear of death, which Thomas Hobbes thought would force everyone into a kind of social contract and cooperation and obedience, that he was wrong about that, and that the pandemic proved again why he was wrong?
That's not a sufficient basis for a society that lasts.
So, well, Irene is probably about to ask this question, but may I ask it?
Okay.
So what else do we need?
Claro.
Well, I think we need the things we've been discussing. I think mutual recognition is essential.
Right. Yeah.
And that starts with understanding our work as more than just something that allows us to buy things and be consumers and to exchange with each other as buyers and sellers, but understanding our work in some sense as a vocation. And that requires seeing it connected to other vocations within the economy that each require the other and that form a kind of interlocking system of production.
Production and recognition.
Well, yes, production and recognition.
Yeah.
Ok, bien, no vamos a seguir con Hobbes, pero sí con el Estado. Y yo os quería preguntar, no me resisto a sacar este tema, que quizá no es el que más os apetece, pero de cara a las elecciones presidenciales de Estados Unidos que tenemos a la vuelta de la esquina. Me gustaría saber qué pensáis de un diagnóstico que diste, Michael, en 2020 sobre la unión entre el fracaso político de la meritocracia, y tú decías, las expectativas generadas por el relato meritocrático no se han visto satisfechas, y el auge de los populismos en el norte global. Con las nuevas elecciones, con Trump, en esa carrera presidencial, ¿el escenario es el mismo con estos 4 años de diferencia que cuando tú diagnosticaste ese voto? ¿Creéis que se mantendrá el voto de castigo a este término fantástico, la soberbia meritocrática? Y si esto es así, y aquí ya surge la verdadera pregunta que también surgió a partir de la lectura de tu libro, es ¿por qué alguien votaría por proyectos o por partidos o por proyectos, como en el caso del Brexit, que no parece que nieguen el relato meritocrático? Es decir, si tu propuesta es que lo que sucede con este voto de castigo es que la gente ha visto que esas expectativas del relato meritocrático no se ven satisfechas, ¿por qué alguien votaría por un proyecto como el Brexit o por alguien como Trump, que no me parece que en ningún caso venga a negar ese relato, ese mito, ya si me permitís, ese mito meritocrático.
Right. Well, I think, unfortunately, the populist anger against meritocratic elites persists, which is why it's impossible to predict who will win this election. It's possible Trump could be reelected. Joe Biden did try to speak some about the dignity of work, but he didn't offer a full vision that was inspiring to reorient our attitudes toward work, contribution, success. And so many people, working people, continue to feel that meritocratic elites, the winners of the age of globalization, look down on them. That persists, which is why I think, despite his outrageous statements, even in the debates, Trump still could win. I think it's evenly divided. But I think there's a deeper problem with our public discourse. We've spoken about the need to attend to the dignity of work. One of the biggest unresolved questions that we face, we've spoken about polarization, is climate change. And it seems that the response to climate change by elites repeats the same technocratic, meritocratic hubris or arrogance that ordinary people resent. We will tell you how to change your lives to enable us to make a transition to a green economy. If only we get the right economic incentives in place and the right technological fix, we'll solve climate change, even if it transforms the economy and your place in the economy. So it's the same technocratic arrogance. But what that misses is the need, perhaps, to reconsider our attitudes toward nature, our way of living with nature, which connects with the theme that Adam writes about, and you mentioned it at the outset, Irene, about rethinking our relation to the world, to the natural world in this case, that we inhabit. If we have time, can we ask Adam to explain this changed attitude toward nature that your account of happiness urges us to consider?
I'm skeptical of the idea that the technological power that got us into trouble and has contributed to global warming will also be sufficient to escape the problem, that we can, by the same technological means, somehow reverse or mitigate or adjust the way that we live to escape the problem we started. And that's because the problem isn't only about human health and security. I think when we think of the climate crisis, those terms are the most prominent. An existential threat. This gets back to the pandemic. We're all facing a threat to our lives. It gets back to Thomas Hobbes. And I think this fear of the devastation that will be caused by global warming is a continuation of that way of thinking. And I'm certainly not saying we should neglect that. I think, of course, security and health is important and necessary, but it's not the most important or the highest thing in life. And I think what is absolutely fundamental is that we recover a respect for nature that we've lost. By nature, I mean what's given, something that carries its own significance, that isn't simply matter to be formed to whatever purposes we decide. That's the technological orientation to the world, a willful stance that nature, the things of nature are merely unformed matter to be recreated and given meaning by us as human subjects. And what that overlooks is the way in which nature, think of natural wonders, that would be one very striking example, present a certain meaning to us to be interpreted, and it leads us to rethink our own sense of self, the way we live our sense of self, possession, the friendships we have, the way we relate to society. Nature is a field of symbols and metaphors, which in these days is relegated to poetry and literature. It's not considered a genuinely objective or scientific way of viewing things. But I think that's a mistake, that there's a certain fundamental encounter with nature, the way in which things originally strike us and move us in various ways, long before we reconceptualize them to be objects of our experiments and our technological purposes.
Sí, de hecho estaba pensando que en el grupo de humanidades ecológicas de mi universidad que dirige Carmen Madorrán hablamos mucho de cómo puede ser que teniendo evidencia científica del cambio climático no parece que eso sea un problema que seduzca, que interese en gran medida a los votantes. Pienso sobre todo cuando alguien tiene que coger una papeleta y dar su confianza y su voto a un partido político. No parece que sea el problema más relevante al que prestemos más atención. Diría que estamos quizá en una fase de negación donde, y ahí entra de lo que estaba hablando Adam, caemos en una suerte de tecnooptimismo, podremos encontrar las fórmulas para salir de esta, ¿no? Y ahí os quería preguntar, como personas que os habéis dedicado al discurso público y a pensar cómo comunicamos y cómo hablamos en una comunidad, ¿cuál pensáis que sería la forma correcta de abordar? Pienso en el cambio climático porque es de lo que estábamos hablando, pero problemas o cuestiones, más que problemas, perdón, cuestiones como la inmigración, cuestiones de nacionalidad, cómo se otorgan los permisos de residencia, cuestiones que son, sin lugar a dudas, lo que más conflicto genera o lo que más polarización genera en nuestras comunidades, cómo deberíamos abordarlo para tener un debate sosegado y realista sobre este tipo de problemas.
Well, could I try to respond to that, Irene, by offering a hypothetical question?
Mm-hmm.
Well, to you first and then maybe to Adam.
Okay.
You mentioned techno-optimism, and that's a dominant, influential way of thinking about what Adam was saying, that we treat nature and the climate crisis as something to be controlled through a technological fix. So here's the hypothetical question. Suppose we came up with a technological innovation that would fix the problem of carbon emissions. Some super absorbent device that would absorb all of the carbon we emit and alleviate that crisis. Would you regard the technological fix as an unqualified good or as a mixed blessing? A mixed blessing because, on the one hand, it would achieve a certain aim, but at the price of letting us off the hook, of sparing us the need to reflect on the deeper question Adam raises about how should we live in harmony with nature rather than in opposition to nature, viewing nature as something we should control. In a way, it's like the question Adam posed about whether Nadal and Federer, whether one of them would rather win by a forfeit or lose in a match that deepened their display of the virtues of competing and learning from each other and recognizing and developing a kind of friendship as they did with one another. So it's analogous maybe to that. So what would be your answer to the hypothetical? Unqualified good, the technocratic fix, or mixed blessing?
Me pones en un aprieto. Me pones en un aprieto porque entonces, como alguien de filosofía, lo que diría, quizá a lo que tenemos que ver es, o donde yo pondría el acento, sería en si este nuevo cambio, esta nueva tecnología que consigue reducir estas emisiones de carbono nos aporta algo al bien común. ¿Necesitamos producir tantas emisiones de carbono? Quizá no. Y entonces el problema no vaya por buscar tanto una solución a esas emisiones, una nueva tecnología, sino porque de verdad tengamos un debate más sosegado sobre qué tipo de vida buena, y engarzo con Adam, qué tipo de vida buena es la que buscamos y si eso nos aporta algo al bien común, si quizá no estamos más en economías de transición donde el debate no es qué tipo de tecnología queremos y si eso es inherentemente bueno o malo o cómo lo vamos a asumir, sino creo que los debates quizá son otros, pero esto entiendo que es una jugada de filosofía donde simplemente lo que estoy diciendo es no quiero responder a esa pregunta y entonces salgo por ahí. Pero bueno, no lo sé. Que me interesa saber también cómo lo ve Adam, porque él es el que más ha escrito y ha pensado sobre esto. Entonces quizá...
Yeah. What do you think?
Well,
Claro.
for me it's easy. I would say mixed blessing.
Mixed blessing, okay.
And maybe one example helps illustrate this. When we focus on finding alternative sources of energy. Take, for example, wind-generated energy, which, from the perspective of solving global climate change, is all to the good. It's clean energy. But the disposition and attitude necessary for that may lead us to lose appreciation for nature in the form of wind as we encounter it in our daily lives and respond to it. So wind, when it becomes a source of energy, is just represented numerically. We don't experience wind as a force at all. It's just calculable. It's brought within the range of what we can control, but only by denaturing it or distorting it. Whereas, let's say somebody who's engaged in the activity of sailing, who understands the wind in a radically different way, in a more original, direct way, as a powerful force that one has to respond to and one has to respect, because you can only sail the boat if you very carefully adjust the sail to the wind and the change of its direction, and you feel its force very powerfully in the context of that activity. At the same time, while using so it's a kind of use that is also a response. So there is mutual agency on the part of nature and oneself. This kind of connection with nature, whereby we understand nature as essential to our own being, is what gets lost if the only focus is on a technological appropriation of nature for the needs of our health and security. And that's, publicly at least, the predominant way of relating to nature. So we lose something when we adopt the modern scientific, technological perspective on things. So mixed blessing.
Could I say one more word about
Absolutamente.
this? If we come back to the politics of climate change and the transition to a green economy, I worry that we are already beginning to make the same mistake we made that generated anger and alienation and a sense of powerlessness among ordinary citizens during the pandemic, when people felt experts were telling them what to do, but also during 4 decades of neoliberal globalization, when experts said, these policies will make everyone better, trust us. And it was top-down technocratic public reasoning. And we're seeing the same thing with a kind of technocratic top-down approach to the transition to a green economy. Now, I think instead that we need to create a genuine public debate about how to make that transition in a way that listens to the voices of people who fear their ways of life will be upended, whether they work in the fossil fuel industry, coal miners, farmers. Across Europe, there's deep opposition we see already from farming communities who feel that their way of life is being transformed. And yet again, the experts say, no, trust us, we've worked out the policies, we have a technocratic solution, but we see a backlash in Europe and in the United States to this kind of, and therefore resistance to doing something about climate change. I think we need to rethink the top-down technocratic approach to create forums for genuine deliberation within communities, including working people, including people who work in the fossil fuel industry, including farmers who say you can't ban fertilizer because otherwise we won't be able to produce food and so on. I was making this proposal when I wrote an essay for the New York Times on what Kamala Harris, what the Democratic Party's position should be and how they should shift the terms of this technocratic, meritocratic rhetoric to a more participatory way of wrestling with the transition to the green economy. And I said that means creating forums in local communities where people who work in manufacturing and fossil fuels, farmers, I wrote in my first draft, can deliberate together with public officials and scientists and community leaders to decide together how to make the transition to green economy. And the editor just made a small stylistic edit saying how these working people and farmers could come together and learn from the people, the public officials making these decisions, how better to understand the policy. And I said, no, that's not a stylistic change. My point is that they have a voice, they participate in deliberating, which goes back to the connection with which you began between conceptions of the common good, public deliberation, recognize one another as citizens, giving everyone a voice to overcome the sense of disempowerment. How that's connected ultimately to thinking through the fundamental questions about the good life that Adam writes about in his book, Happiness in Action.
Adam, no sé si quieres añadir algo más, si quieres decir algo más, y si no, ¿estás bien?
That was great.
Okay.
My dad has the last word.
Bien, bonitas palabras. Entonces, en nombre del Círculo de Bellas Artes, de la fábrica, me gustaría agradeceros muchísimo a los dos vuestra participación, vuestra generosidad por estar aquí. Creo que todo el público está infinitamente agradecido por esta conversación, por la que está por venir, por ayer la intervención de Adam. Así que de verdad, muchísimas gracias a los dos y un fuerte aplauso.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.